with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Is the Great Lakes region destined to become a climate refuge? Tonight, to cap our partnership with the Council of the Great Lakes region during the Great Lakes Public Forum in Niagara Falls, we'll examine what the balance between opportunity and conservation could look like. Then, do you know where you were 50 years ago today? Maybe, like yours truly, you were celebrating Canada's greatest hockey triumph ever, the 1972 Summit Series. Hall of Fame goaltender Ken Dryden is with us to remember all 8 momentous games. It's Wednesday, September 28th. Henderson has scored for Canada. And that's tonight on the agenda. With plenty of fresh water and a moderate, stable climate, the Great Lakes region could be seen as an outlier as global warming transforms ecosystems around the world. If that's on the horizon, what does it mean for protecting and preserving this critical watershed, even as the region welcomes more and more people? Well, let's find out. And we're going to ask in London, UK, Aaron Barter. He is Director of Innovation and Sustainability at Waterfront Toronto. In Ypsilanti, Michigan, Beth Gibbons, Executive Director at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And in our nation's capital, Dave Sawyer, Principal Economist at the Canadian Climate Institute. And it's good of all three of you to join us here on TVO tonight for this very timely discussion. I want to start, Beth, get us started here. Does the Great Lakes region seem set to become a so-called climate haven? What's your view on that?
Well, there's certainly the potential that it could become that. As we look at the Great Lakes region, we see a place that has relatively less climate risk than other areas. We're not facing sea level rise. We have a relatively lower risk to things like forest fires and wildfires, and we have ample fresh water. So there is an opportunity here for us to be thinking about this region as a place with climate havens, but there's a lot of work for us to do in order to make that kind of tantalizing idea a reality.
And we will figure that out as we continue our conversation. But first, I want to hear from everybody on this. Go ahead, Dave. What's your view on it?
Yeah, Beth makes some really good points. I think we also have to think about a broader set of climate impacts around heat, for example, and precipitation, impacting agriculture and forestry to a lesser extent in the region, and manufacturing. So it is a bit of a mixed bag in the region.
Aaron, what say you?
Well, I think it could be, and I believe that opportunity would bring a lot of good things to the region. But I think there's a lot of hard work still to be done to make it a true climate haven, to make it resilient against the worst impacts of climate change that are not just on the horizon, but that are already upon us here.
Beth, can you just go into a bit more depth about what it is about the Great Lakes environment that potentially makes it safer than, say, other places on this earth as it relates to climate change?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, as we've already talked about, I think twice in this conversation, having 80% of North America's surface freshwater, 20% of the world's surface freshwater is one of the iconic features that gives us greater security in this region. As the other guests have said, this is not a region without existing climate risk. We've already seen a 45% increase in overall precipitation in this area from 1950 up to 2020. And so we have impacts that we are dealing with. But if we think about the impacts from climate change here in the Great Lakes region, we really come down to an abundance of fresh water. We have a terrific amount of fresh water. We're going to have a terrific amount of fresh water that is going to be falling on our region. More water, often less water when we need it, more water when we don't. So we'll need to deal with that dichotomy. And I don't want to dismiss the heat risk, because that is incredibly important that we attend to that, especially as we think about our housing stock and how we're able to care for people who are already here and those to come. But as we compare that to what we see from sea level rise and other places in the United States alone, we know that there's 13.1 million people who live in places that will be fully inundated with 3 feet of sea level rise. And we have every reason to believe that we're moving to that by mid-century. And so we can look around and say there are people who are going to be forced into motion. Whether or not they come here is a much more difficult question to answer, but we certainly can see where there is more security in our future and where people are going to be moving. Now, making that bridge to this is where they'll come to, that remains a really difficult challenge for us, and a question that I think we're all grappling with.
Beth, just a quick follow-up. 13.1 million people in the U.S. living where the sea is going to rise 3 feet. Give me a handful of states of what you're talking about.
Oh, we're looking at the southeast United States, looking at Florida, our coastal area, the Gulf Coast. These are places that are well aware of their climate risk. Whether or not politically they've been able to address it is another question. We're obviously seeing, well, right in this moment, we're seeing a hurricane bearing down on Florida. And that is the kind of large-scale event that is becoming more common. And not only are we seeing sea level rise, but of course the increase in these extreme storms are also pushing people into motion.
Indeed. Aaron, as you talk to your colleagues on this issue, do you find there is general consensus for the thesis that we're discussing tonight?
Well, we know that there's going to be a tremendous amount of growth in the Toronto region over the next 20, 30 years. We know that there's going to be 3.9 million more people living in the Greater Toronto Area than there were just a couple of years ago. And so whether that's being driven by climate migration directly or by a variety of other factors, we know that the region will continue to grow. And what we think is very important, and what we're trying to do here at Waterfront Toronto, is make sure that new growth that's happening in the city meets a very high standard of climate resilience, and that those people who choose to move to this part of the country and to this part of the world are protected and are able to thrive in place during a future that is less stable. And so in our case, we're focused on making communities more resilient through the built environment. So making those new construction projects more resilient to flooding and heat threats, like we've heard on this call, and also ensuring that we have housing and equitable community amenities available to everyone who's going to be coming to this region. So there's consensus on the growth that will be happening in the region, and I think that a lot of that is going to be driven by climate change. And so what we can do in Toronto and across the Great Lakes region in general is make sure that we're ready for it and make sure that we have construction standards and projects in place to house all of those new residents.
Gotcha. Okay, Dave, amplify on that a bit if you would. This scenario that we're discussing here, if it in fact does come to pass over the ensuing decades, presumably opens the door to some significant economic opportunities for the Great Lakes region. Can you just give us a sense about, what we're talking about specifically in terms of those economic opportunities?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about some opportunities and some risks as well, because let's just deal with the risks because we're talking about climate impacts first. So the Canadian Climate Institute just released a report today on the costs of climate change in Canada. And we find, although Ontario is not susceptible to these major events like Fiona, a full range of climate impacts are causing a drag on the economy, productivity impacts in labor and manufacturing, for example, road and rail delay, infrastructure challenges with heat days and floods. And we find at a household level, those impacts today manifest into an income loss of about $2,000 per household. So about $700 per individual, 2.5, 3 individuals per household. So although we have lower climate risk in the region than other regions, it's not to say that climate change is not a drag on the economy today. So that's the first thing to sort of think about. And then there are opportunities to address those impacts through adaptation, proactive adaptation. And Beth can talk, I'm sure, a lot more about that. And then so on the opportunity side, a lot of this has to do with low carbon futures in Canada's manufacturing base. So when I think of Climate Haven, I also think of emission reductions, and there are two sources of big benefits there. So one source of benefit is reduced improved air quality from getting off fossil fuels. Almost $1 billion investment, federal and provincial investment in the Hamilton steel mills to clean them up. Major local air quality impacts, which reduce healthcare costs, increase worker productivity. And then finally, the manufacturing base. We're going to be selling a lot of tech, and we are selling a lot of tech, clean tech. So I think of Climate Haven as those sort of three spaces: climate impacts, clean economy, and then the benefits from reducing fossil fuel use.
Beth, do you want to amplify on that in terms of the economic opportunities?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I think that those three pieces I really strongly agree with. The thing I would add to it that's really critical for a place to fall into this climate haven category is that there's also the affordable housing. And so I know that Toronto has been leading in adaptation for a long time. And I think that there's really thoughtful work going into that balance of how do you welcome those anticipated 3.9 million more people while it remains a place for people who are here today. And so when we're thinking about what carves out that climate haven definition, I really appreciated that, thinking about the impacts, thinking about the clean economy, and then really thinking about, is this a place for everyone to be? Because a climate haven cannot be called, well, in the work that we've been doing, we are not thinking about climate havens as places that are exclusively for the rich or for those who are making this choice simply through amenity migration, but also for people who are being pushed into motion because of dealing with disasters and may not have the economic wherewithal that others are currently having when they're choosing to move to more climate safe spaces.
Well, that's a great point. So decision makers who are potentially watching this, you would like them to know that whatever happens, it's got to be seen through a sort of an equity lens and not just a haven for the rich. Is that the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a very real possibility that climate migration becomes deeper gentrification of our cities, and that we also see a continuous kind of sprawl, and where people are being forced to the edges of metro areas where they're not able to live, where they have to work. And we have to make sure that as we're thinking proactively, we're finding ways to avoid that. And so there's such a difference in the planning that's able to happen right now between the greater Toronto area and the U.S. Great Lakes region. The U.S. Great Lakes region continues to see a decline in population. So here, a discussion about growth is really kind of fighting what the demographic trends look like already. And so we have a much harder time kind of moving to investing in that kind of infrastructure, affordable housing, the sort of assets that we know our American cities are going to need. As we look to the GTA, I think we really see a model of where there is anticipated growth in the way in which growth can be done in a manner that is more sustainable and more equitable. At least that, I would say that is my hope. And maybe that's a question for the other gentleman to say, is that right for us in the US to be looking to the GTA for that kind of leadership?
Well, I may circle back to that in a moment, but while we're on this issue of whether or not we can actually do something in this field, I want to get Aaron back in here and talk about something called Billiards Island. Have I pronounced that properly? Billiards Island?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to, I think we got a graphic on this. I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this graphic up, because you at Waterfront Toronto are overseeing so-called climate positive community development on a new piece of land at Toronto's waterfront. And the gist is 5,000 new homes for 10,000 people. It is mostly car-free, or it would be mostly car-free neighborhoods, apartments heated by geothermal energy, flood control by way of 2 new outlets for the Don River, and obviously this would all be sort of designed to be state-of-the-art with climate change in mind. Let's ask the obvious question. How do you build a new community that can be potentially immune to climate emergencies?
Well, it's a great question, and something that we've grappled with. Our objective with Billiards Island is to demonstrate what equitable, climate resilient, and zero carbon growth can look like. Taking Beth's point, I think is important, which is that we will be seeing growth across the Great Lakes region, and we're seeing that growth today here in the GTA. And so that's what we're trying to do in Billiards Island. We've been working on the project for quite some time now, and we're under construction with the flood protection landforms. As you said, creating 2 new outlets for the Don River and protecting hundreds of acres of downtown Toronto from flooding and from extreme weather events that will be getting worse with climate change. So that foundation for the community is being built now, and our teams are hard at work on the next stage, which will be the buildings that you mentioned, the energy systems in collaboration with folks like Toronto Hydro and Enwave, and bringing it all together within what is a complete and inclusive community. And for us, that means having a target of 30% affordable housing, affordable rental housing within the project, as well as having job opportunities and have the economic benefits of that growth going back to vulnerable and marginalized populations. So this is what we're doing with support from governments. Again, all of this is with the Government of Canada, the Province of Ontario, and the City of Toronto, and trying to create a model for what climate positive growth can look like, with the objective of replicating it across the region and across the country. As we know, the impacts of climate change are going to keep getting worse.
Aaron, when will this be ready to move into?
It's a good question. These things never happen as quickly as you'd like, but by the latter half of this decade, we should have buildings ready for folks to be moving into, which would include, to Beth's earlier point, those migrants from across North America and from around the world who are looking for somewhere to go as the climate continues to change.
Now, you're going to forgive this cheeky little question here, but I do remember government authorities saying that the LRT that's going in 100 meters north of this studio would be ready already. And now they're saying, not this year, maybe not even next year. So when you say the latter half of this decade, can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, our flood protection measure is really the first major milestone, and that'll be completed in 2024. And after we have the whole region protected against the impacts of flooding from the Don River, then we'll get started on the next phase, which will be the parks, public realm, streets, and buildings ultimately. So it is a long project. We've been at it since 2017, just on this one initiative. And we hope to have it completed as soon as possible.
As soon as possible gives you nice wiggle room. I get it. I understand why you can't be more specific than that. Dave, let me get you back in here and ask, this is one idea that really has caught the imagination of a lot of people. What do you think the key is to successfully completing projects such as this one and others like it?
Government will to drive these things forward and to recognize the significant paybacks associated with hardening our assets, with building low carbon tech into building design. Again, this report we just did, we found a massive scale up and adaptation in the country can reduce the costs of climate change in half, with paybacks in the order of 15 to 1, as they work their way through the economy. So governments need to, I think, understand a little better what they get from adaptation and these sorts of investments, and how they are just, good investments, good economic policy. And so, you really want to see these projects scaled up and implemented coast to coast, and not just in buildings, but in manufacturing, for example, like green roofs to reduce the heat impacts on manufacturing facilities. The list goes on. So being thoughtful like that, the bullet points we just saw is step one, and then the political will to invest and drive it forward.
How well do you know this project, A, and do you think they're doing it upright, B?
Well, I don't know the project that well, but I certainly know the area. And yeah, the list there looks really interesting, doesn't it? So geothermal heat has high paybacks in terms of you're not burning fossil local air quality problems. Your heating and cooling costs are quite lower. In the future, with climate change, we're going to have higher temperatures in the summer, so more cooling demand, and lower temperatures in the winter often, so more heating demand. So having a dual purpose, geothermal system is really, really good. Gives you mitigation benefits, so reductions in emissions, which are maybe saleable, or they get funded through government programs, and then it's a good adaptation measure for the long term. And then flood control, right? Like flood controls are some of the largest costs in the country, certainly for the Toronto area. I don't have to tell your listeners how costly these floods are. So getting the Don under control clearly is a good step forward. So it's a nice integrated piece, it looks like.
Gotcha. Beth, tell us about whether or not there are already cities along the Great Lakes that are identifying themselves already as climate refuge cities.
So there are some cities that I think that have taken up this title and decided to try to find out how to live into it. And those are cities like Buffalo, New York, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Duluth, Minnesota, that have had this title put on them by researchers, and in some cases, I would say by the media, who are asking this question of where will people go? And Buffalo and Duluth specifically were named in a New York Times article several years ago, and so now have grappled with what does that mean for us. In the city of Buffalo, it's really meant that they're thinking about the way they use their Office for New Americans, which has been known and has a strong reputation as welcoming migrants. After Hurricane Maria, there were over 5,000 Puerto Ricans who went from Puerto Rico to Buffalo who have remained there. And that was a sign that Buffalo is able to accommodate migrants. And now, as we're seeing other hurricanes come through, once we start to see these diaspora paths kind of forged, they're likely to be followed. Buffalo is thinking about how do they now bring climate information and climate adaptation into the way that they are already welcoming migrants. And so this is where they're really working on kind of inter-office coordination in order to not just be a welcoming place, but to be an adapted place as well. If we look at the city of Ann Arbor, this is a city that has a benefit of a university partnership that's always been very strong with the University of Michigan. And they've worked with the University of Michigan for a long time to bring in best available climate information in order to scale their infrastructure, scale their things like water systems. And now they're working with researchers to understand if we scale up our water systems, our stormwater and our wastewater facility to accommodate climate impacts, what do we need to also do to accommodate potential growth? And so they've worked with Dr. Matt Hauer, who's a demographer from Florida State University, to try to get the best available projections to show when those people who are being pushed into motion, those that we are pretty confident are going to move because of sea level rise, people who may move because of heat or drought or fire, how many will be coming to the Ann Arbor area and how do they need to scale their infrastructure? So I think those are two examples of cities that have heard this title and have decided to begin adopting it into their planning.
And a quick follow with you, Beth. I know when I was a kid, Southern Ontario was considered so sleepy and Buffalo was considered so cool that was the place to go on a Saturday night because there was nothing going on here. Let's face it, Buffalo has been in decline pretty much ever since. And it is not the city today. It does not have the significant place in urban America today that it certainly did 50 years ago. So my question for you is this a road back for Buffalo in your view?
I think it's a potential road back. I certainly think having a conversation about Buffalo, having it in the news, having a spotlight on it is good for the city. I think that the Buffalo Bills winning this season is good for the city too, though. And so, we never quite know where these things are going to lead us.
Are you a member of Bills Mafia? Let's get that on the record right now.
Yes.
You are, eh?
Yes.
You are. Okay. Listen, that was a miserable loss in Miami on the weekend, but don't give up hope yet, right?
I'm not. I have never.
Even with those 4 straight Super Bowl losses here, you're not giving up hope yet.
Oh, my dad is from Buffalo. Those were rough years when I was a little kid, but yeah, we get through them.
Good for you, Beth. Good for you. Aaron, the example we talked about a moment ago, Billiards Island. Do you think this is a template that can be exported to other places around the continent?
I do. I think that we have some unique. Obviously, we have government-owned land, lots of government investment in the project, and I think that the more we can de-risk some of these ideas, the more that they can get picked up by development projects in growth areas across the country. And we're starting to see that happen. There's some fantastic projects across the GTA, and we're seeing some amazing work coming out of Vancouver with low carbon construction and some of these zero carbon development projects. So yes, I think there's massive opportunity to replicate what we've learned. We've also really been figuring out the world of flood protection within a brownfield context. And so I think there's a lot that we can take and extend across Canada and across the Great Lakes region. I'll also emphasize that to one of Dave's earlier points, there's a huge economic uplift that comes from companies that can participate in these projects. And so as we think about Canadian firms that have clean technologies, building technologies, renewable energy technologies, integrating those into these growth areas within places like Billiards Island creates a massive opportunity for them to get carried along with this wave of activity in climate resilient neighborhoods and see the purchases that come with that. So it's something that we're trying to be more deliberate on and ensure that we're creating opportunities for those local firms that have technologies that can get neighborhoods down to net zero.
Dave, one of the words I heard Aaron say there was de-risk, the importance of de-risking those projects. What exactly does that mean?
Well, there's a split incentive on the benefits of these projects. So the developer themselves don't necessarily gain all the societal benefits, or the homeowner, gains a small portion of the investment. Maybe they don't want to spend the extra upfront costs. So de-risking is really about governments stepping in and trying to close the gap between public benefit and private benefit. So that's one. And then de-risking is also sort of learning by doing so. So picking up Aaron's point, demonstration matters. We gain skills. We basically get better at implementing stuff, and then we can do it cheaper with more expertise. And so then you start to, once you start a critical mass, you start crowding in expertise and capital and investment and interest, and then you get the ball rolling. So there's a real role for governments on demonstration in the beginning, just get the learning by doing going, and then ultimately de-risking until the technology costs fall enough that the developer says, hey, I can sell this for a little more. I can make my money back on making this choice, and we can drive forward. So yeah, de-risking is a really important concept to make this stuff happen.
Beth, let's finish up on this. How, and it sort of circles back to something you raised earlier in our discussion, how can Canada and the United States work together to foster the climate resilience we need to see in the Great Lakes region?
Well, I always come back to the relationship that we have to the water. I think that the Great Lakes Compact is one of the most impressive pieces of binational legislation that holds together a commitment to a natural resource unlike anything else. And I think that we can look to the Great Lakes Compact, which is our commitment to keep the water that we share clean and the water that we all depend on clean, as really where do we center ourselves? Because these development patterns, whether it's urban growth that we're seeing in the GTA, whether it's agricultural growth, which we're anticipating in the upper Midwest of the United States, those are all going to come together and how it impacts the water. And so if we think about how do we want to preserve this resource in a way that is rooted in compassion and sustainability, I think that that is the way that we then say, okay, so if we're committed to this, then what does it mean that we commit to in the way that we grow, in the way that we share our resources, and in the way that we want to imagine this vision that we could have of a future which is really I think strong and bright. And what does that look like for us doing this all together?
Dave, last word to you on this. You're in the Canadian capital. You've got friends, no doubt, in the American capital. How do we work together to make it happen?
We make sure the Bills win? No, that's not it, is it? Governance is always a challenge. So we have governance issues in Canada. We have fragmented governance structures, provinces going one way, feds going another way, municipalities another, and then the binational stuff is a little bit of a challenge. So we talk a lot about technology, we talk a lot about finance and investment, but without good governance structures and well-functioning governance systems and processes, this stuff is really at risk. So we can't forget the importance of government getting their act together and frankly working together.
Well, I think the one thing we've confirmed in this conversation is that the Bills make me want to shout, kick my heels up and shout, throw my hands up. And anyway, if you've been to a Bills game, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you think I'm nuts, but it doesn't matter. I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having this conversation. Beth Gibbons, Dave Sawyer, Aaron Barter, great to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Go Bills.
And just a friendly reminder that we are in the final 24 hours of voting on which Great Lake is the greatest of them all. So please visit our website, tvo.org/Great Lakes, to have your say. I can just give you a hint here. One lake is building a decent-sized lead. But there is still time to cast your vote to see your favorite come out on top, so do so. I once asked the Hall of Fame goaltender Ken Dryden, when was the golden age of hockey? His answer, whatever you were watching when you were 12 years old. Well, when I was 12, Team Canada and the Soviet Union met for an 8-game summit series that was, and as far as I'm concerned, still is, the most important hockey series ever played. It all happened 50 years ago this month. One of Team Canada's goalies was Ken Dryden. He chronicles the events of a half-century ago in the series, what I remember, what it felt like, and what it feels like now. And Ken Dryden joins us now here in the studio. So great to have you back here again.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
When this, and we are sitting here on September 28th, 50 years to the day of Game 8. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But when they announced that this was all going to happen, were you anxious to be chosen for this team?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I had finished my first full year with the Canadians, and I had done well in the first couple of years, and this was big. I mean, this was going to be the biggest series that anybody had ever seen, and big because if you were a kid growing up around that time, and I was born in 1947, is that by the time I started to follow hockey, I was becoming aware of international hockey, and particularly, it started in the mid-1950s, when in 1954 the Russians won the World Hockey Championship, and that was stunning, because the Soviet Union had only started hockey 8 years earlier in 1946. They won, and when 1955 came around, that was a big deal, because now we had to win it back. And it was the Penticton Vs that represented Canada, and Foster Hewitt flew to Europe to do the games. And Foster Hewitt didn't do that. I mean, that he was the voice of the Toronto Maple Leafs and of hockey in English Canada. But there he was on the radio, and I'm 7 years old, and I'm in the playground at Humber Valley School, and I'm listening to the final game, and Penticton won 5-0, and that was big. And then we lost the next year in the Olympics in '56 in Cortina, but then we started to win. And Whitby Dunlops in '57, Belleville McFarland's, Trail Smoke Eaters, but then we started to lose, and we weren't going to win again. I mean, that the Europeans were becoming too good. The Soviets were becoming the best of the Europeans, and in the '80s, the national team was created by Father Bauer to attract a lot of the better juniors, but that proved not to be enough either. So when 1972 came around, this was the moment where, for all of those years, when we knew we were the best in the world and everybody knew that, but they were called the world champions, we finally had a chance, and so it was big.
Best on best, finally.
Finally.
Well, it was going to be an 8-game series, 4 here, 4 over there, and you get to start game 1 in Montreal, and everybody assumes that it's going to be a cakewalk, and here's how you remember it. As described in your book, at some point, probably the day before the first game, Team Canada coach Harry Sinden told me I would play, but I don't remember. I don't remember flying to Montreal. I don't remember the day of the game. I don't remember the dressing room. All I remember is a feeling that kept building and building, growing and growing. Okay, what was different?
It was just, it was an excitement. I mean, and Montreal is an exciting place. Montreal is, and was at that time, is now the most exciting hockey place in the world. I had played in the Forum. I had played in the Stanley Cup Finals in the Forum.
So you should have been calm.
Well, I don't know whether I should have been calm, but I should have been used to the atmosphere.
Right.
And the noise of it all. But this kept, as I said, growing and building, and into unfamiliar territory, and of where you don't know what it's building to. You don't know what that means to you, how you're going to react to all of that, because that I hadn't been a part of, and as none of us had been. And when the opening ceremonies took place, and Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau dropped the puck I mean, one of the classic little moments that demonstrated the feeling of it is that this was a ceremonial face-off. And whoever the Soviet player was, I have no idea, but it was Phil Esposito for us. And, you know, ceremonial face-offs, drop the puck, the home team captain just kind of gathers the puck up, picks it up, hands it to the honoree, and that's the end of it. You watch Phil Esposito, he whips it back. And later he says, I had to win that draw. You know, well, that's not how it happens, you know, before, but that's what it felt like.
It shows you it was going to be a different kind of series.
Absolutely.
Well, it was a different kind of first game, that's for sure. Soviet 7, Canada 3, you were in goal, and here's what you wrote. In the dressing room after the game, I must have said something to reporters. I don't know what I said. I didn't want to look in any direction. I didn't want anyone to look at me. I don't remember feeling I had let everyone down, my teammates, my country. I was just embarrassed. I didn't want to hide. I wanted the world to go away. What was the kind of consensus in the dressing room after you realized, after game one, this is not going to be the 8-game sweep we were told it was going to be?
I think that feeling started earlier than the end of the first game. I think it started probably by the middle of the first period. But again, you're so absorbed in playing that you're not entirely conscious of it. But that kind of recognition is starting to creep in. That even, you know, we scored in the first minute, but then before we scored in the sixth minute, which would seem to be incredibly decisive. I mean, 2 goals in the first 6 minutes. But between those 2 goals, even. That play was back and forth. It was pretty even. They looked like they belonged. And then after we scored the second goal, then at some point they made it 2-1, and before the end of the period it was 2-2. And I can remember coming back and I make reference to it, into the dressing room, and Harry Sinden, our coach, says, well, you didn't think it was going to be easy, did you? And of course, we did.
You did, yes.
But at that moment, I think there was a recognition that this was going to be tough.
Paul Henderson was in this studio 9 years ago. We talked about you. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that clip.
I never felt so sorry for Ken Dryden in my life. Every time he thought they were going to shoot it, they passed it. When he thought they were going to pass it, they shot it. And major league wake-up call.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, in a lot of ways, that is what it was.
Did you have to figure out how to completely play your game differently, given that the opponent was playing a brand of hockey you were not accustomed to?
Yeah, I mean, when you're a goalie, you're a responder. You're not an initiator. So you respond to what's in front of you, what's coming at you. If what's coming at you is different, you have to have a different response. And so, that in the NHL, certainly by the 60s, even the late 50s and into the 70s, it was a power game. It was the big shooters, the curved blades, Bobby Hull, Frank Mahovlich, 100 miles an hour, just blasting the puck from the wings. And so the puck would be moved forward. It would be moved to the wing for the big shot. I mean, goalies, we wore a lot better equipment than had been in the past, but it still wasn't great. And it wasn't that big. And so there was an awful lot of net that was open, no matter what position we were in. And here's a puck coming at you 100 miles an hour. You don't have much time to move very far. And so the only way you could really counteract that is to move out in what's called cutting the angle. And so all of that's great for an NHL game. Here you had the Soviets coming down, and instead of making the big shot, they'd look to pass it laterally. You pass it laterally, I'm out to cut the angle on one. This other shooter has got a whole open net. And all that you can see is, all you can do is you sort of throw yourself back, throw it an arm, throw it a leg, and hope. And I was doing far too much of that. I mean, of just, protecting the net with a single arm or a single leg. I had to find a way of fighting all of my instincts and training to move myself back into the net so I could adapt to the passing.
You figured it out.
Well, it was painful, and I mean, it was.
Well, okay, so game one doesn't go too well. Game two was in Toronto, and your teammate with the Montreal Canadiens, Pete Mahovlich, scores still, for my money, the best shorthanded goal I've ever seen in my life, and I want to see it again. Sheldon, go.
Then Esposito cleared out. It's a race down with Peter Mahovlich going in on goal. Right in! He scores! Peter Mahovlich! What an effort by Peter Mahovlich!
I don't know what was more fun, watching that just now or watching you react to that just now. You still get a kick out of that.
Well, and just knowing Pete, and as I've said to Pete, that when Tony Esposito and I weren't playing in the games, we didn't sit on the bench as the backup. We sat in the crowd. So I was in the crowd for that game, and Peter, of course, has been milking his goal forever, and I'm saying, Pete, I have no visual memory of your goal whatsoever. The only thing I do have a memory of is that I have a memory of my own voice, and my own voice is, ooh, oh, ah.
That makes sense because there's three parts to that goal.
Yeah, and it was that, and like in the book, there's a picture of Peter scoring that goal, and the caption is, ooh, oh, ah.
Well, unfortunately for you guys, you blow a lead in Winnipeg and have to settle for a tie, and then you lose in Vancouver and get booed off the ice. Yikes. And Phil Esposito gives this legendary Gettysburg Address after the game in an interview with Johnny Esau. And again, I want to see some of that too. Sheldon, if you would.
Every one of us guys, 35 guys that came out and played for Team Canada, we did it because we love our country and not for any other reason, no other reason. They can throw the money for the pension fund out the window. They can throw anything they want out the window. We came because we love Canada. And even though we play in the United States and we earn money in the United States, Canada is still our home, and that's the only reason we come. And I don't think it's fair that we should be booed.
That speech, we are told, had a massive impact on the Canadian people who watched it after the game was over. What about on you?
No, because we never saw it. We're in the dressing room after the game, and we're not. There are no TVs in the dressing room, and we're not exactly in a mood to be watching our teammates being interviewed. And I'm not even sure that any of us knew about it for weeks later, if not months later. But I think that that the point is correct. I think it had a real impact on the Canadian public, because I mean, it really is a classic, and it is like a speech rather than an answer. And here you have this moment where we're not only booed off the ice, we're booed on the ice, and fans are just really angry with us. I mean, again, this is supposed to be our moment, that of showing the world what we are. And now we're behind 2-1 with one game tied. Now we're heading to Moscow,
Big
where
ice.
it really gets tough.
Yeah.
And here are these NHL players who, with the World Hockey Association now, are competing for us, big contracts, agents carrying attaché cases. These are guys that clearly don't care. That they don't care. Look at them out on the ice. They don't care. And look at us. We care as fans. We care desperately as fans. And then Esposito, you see that face on that screen, sweat pouring down his face, the look in his eyes.
He cares.
The tone in his voice, he cares. Yeah. And the fans, I'm sure at home, it's like, right. Yes, and I think really from that moment on, the series started as us and the fans. It became a kind of us and them by Vancouver, and I think it was an us and us afterwards.
The one game in this series I really understood the least was Game 5, which you guys were all set to win, and then somehow the Soviets like bang, 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 and they win, and you guys go off the ice, 3,000 fans from Canada are cheering you now as you go off the ice. And from what I've heard from other players, you go in the dressing room after the game and you feel, okay, we know we can beat these guys now. I don't get that. You just lost again.
Yeah.
And you lost in a bad way again.
Yeah.
Where did that confidence come from?
Yeah, I think. I mean, it was the first. Even in Toronto, we played well. I think in Moscow, that first game, we found our game, and I think that was the feeling in it. Yeah, we blew it, and we shouldn't have blown it, and now we're even further up against it, 3-1. You know that we're down, but we were good that night, and I think that the ways in which we weren't good were fixable, and whereas before there were enough things that were going wrong that you weren't entirely sure that they could be fixed in time. Now we knew that they could be, and now it was a matter of doing it. But I don't know. The Canadian fans, and we may get into this later. But the Canadian fans were amazing. I mean, they really were. I mean, and all you need to do again is just try to imagine. This is 1972. You know, Canadians aren't traveling to Europe a heck of a lot in 1972, and they certainly aren't traveling behind the Iron Curtain or to Moscow. And here are 3,000 Canadians descending on Moscow. And these are not bucket list Canadians with the means to go out and just decide that they want certain experiences and go to certain places, and they can fund their way to get there, and then they check it off, and it's gone, except as a story to tell their friends. These were people who were pretty ordinary Canadians who were there from a lot of different places that weren't called Toronto or Montreal, but a lot of small places across the country, and who just felt they needed to be there. And whether it had to do with hockey or with Canada or with, chances are, with both, there was some mix of the two that got inside them, and that they decided they needed to be there. And 3,000 Canadians,
made more noise than 10,000 Soviets.
I was going to say,
yeah,
that's exactly what they did. And the classic was that they came up with this chant, and that was amazing.
Did you know what it was when you first? It was Da Da Canada, Niet Soviet.
Yeah.
Did you know what it was when you first heard it?
Yeah, I did. Well, I had played with the national team, and I had played, and so I knew, a few Russian words, and I certainly knew Da Da Canada and Niet Soviet. But again, whoever came up with it, and it would have been spontaneous, and it would have been kind of dumb stuff with 10 guys in a bar, and then they start it, during the games, and then the other 3,000 people pick it up, and that's pretty nice to hear.
Game 6 is perhaps best known for Bobby Clarke's slash on the ankle of Valery Kharlamov, their best player, or certainly one of their best players, rendering him ineffective for the rest of the series. And you write in your book, this wasn't war, it wasn't life and death, but what if it feels like life and death? What would I have done? I'd like to think I know. I don't know. Have you ever talked to Bobby about that moment? Never have.
I never have. I mean, I never even knew it happened for, I'm sure, a couple of weeks, if not a few months.
You were 10 feet away from it when it happened.
I don't think so.
No?
I don't know. But again, and you preface your question by saying Game 6 was best, known for. I'm not sure it was. I mean, I think in retrospect it was.
Yeah. Not at the time.
But not at the time.
No, it was a win for you guys at the time.
Yes,
big one.
But it's also, I mean, that one, I'm not sure how many people actually saw it at the moment so that it would become a big moment to them at that time. I mean, we're down 3-1 and 1 game tied at that moment. And our focus is absolutely elsewhere. I mean, in terms of trying to win this game, or otherwise the series is over.
Team Canada wins Game 6. Paul Henderson scores the winning goal. Team Canada wins Game 7. Paul Henderson scores the winning goal. Game 8, you're the starting goalie. You're down 5-3 after 2 periods. Put us in the dressing room. Did you guys really think you could come back?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you don't think. You know, you know your situation. I mean, it's 5-3. 7 games and 2 periods have been played. There's 1 period left, 20 minutes. That's it. There isn't a 9th game. There isn't an overtime. There isn't a shootout. There are 20 minutes to go. That's it. This is not a moment to think. This is not because it is a time to know. And the knowing is easy because the circumstances that you're presented with are easy. You know, there's no point in feeling sorry for yourself, you know, worrying about what you didn't do before or the rest of it. It's 20 minutes. And now it's time to do. It's not to think, to worry, to anything else. You just do. And it's always a who knows, you know, with it. And all that you do know is that you just do, and you do it for those 20 minutes, and you see what happens. You see what's going to happen.
I will never get tired of looking at this. Go. 34 seconds to play.
Here's a shot. Henderson made a wild stab towards the bell. Here's another shot. Right by the score. Henderson has scored for Canada. Henderson right in front of the net. And the fans of the team are going wild. Henderson right in front of the goal control. 34 seconds left in the game.
The first question I need to ask you is, what were you doing in that scrum? Goalies don't normally go 200 feet to celebrate with their teammates. What were you doing down there?
Again, you know, you do, you don't think.
Had you ever done that before?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
You know, no, I'm sure I haven't. And I mean, again, you know, that you know, all I can remember is either Henderson's arms going up or the red light going on or something. And then literally, I guess the same almost with the Pete story. I don't have any visual memory. I've got an audio memory. And the memory is I'm around center ice. And goalie skates, especially at that time, they were big, clunky things. And so I'm skating up the ice, at my speed, which I think is really fast, but isn't. And all I can hear is clomp, clomp, clomp. And that's what I hear. I mean, that's my memory of it. I hear this clomp, clomp, clomp of my skates. And I can hear my own whooping in my ears. And then finding myself in that scrum there at the end. And then I mean, I can literally remember and really almost remember it exactly as a scene from a movie, and of where I've seen people in movies saying, you know, that they'd slap themselves in the face and say, "You got to get a hold of yourself," and that's what I did. I mean,
because there's 34 seconds still to play.
Still for 34 seconds. I got to get a hold of myself.
Yeah. Let's finish up on this. You and I agree this was the most important hockey series in human history. But I know there are going to be younger people for whom Sidney Crosby's golden goal at the Olympics or Gretzky to Lemieux, 1987 Canada Cup, will be of more significance because that's their generation.
That's when they were the 12-year-olds.
That's when they were 12. Can you, I don't know if there's any way to be objective about this, but can you make the case that objectively speaking, without one's 12-year-old self and that bias being brought to bear, why, I'm sorry, this series was the most important one ever.
I mean, I think for 2 very demonstrable reasons. That as I said earlier about the Soviets proving that they could play a different way at the top, it changed hockey. I mean, that once that is established, I mean, up until that moment, because Canada had been the originators of hockey, the developers of hockey, the country where the best players, like 100% of the players in the NHL were Canadian. I mean, that's how dominant, you know, things were. So the Canadian way was not only the best way, it was the only way. Then finally, here's this country who plays a different way and shows they can succeed playing that way. That opens a mind. You know, that opens the, you know, thinking. It's like, God, I've always been wondering, why can't we do this? We should try that. You know, and it just goes from there. All of the changes that have happened since that time, off-ice training. I mean, the use of gyms, of making yourselves better in the summer, not just in the winter. The nutrition, the place of all of that. That is totally changed. And then once it happens that one country can show that they can do things differently, then it opens up the possibilities for the Swedes, for the Finns, for now players from Slovenia, making the NHL, from Norway, from Denmark,
Germany.
Impossible that they could play in the NHL. Now they're all playing. Players from Arizona playing in the NHL. I mean, that's what this series did. I mean, it all trails back to this particular moment. So that part of it, and then the other part of it is that, a weekday, a school day, a work day, 22 million the population, 16 million watched. That wasn't the 87 Canada Cup. That wasn't, the Olympics in Vancouver in 2010. I mean, this is the most, in real time shared moment in Canadian history. I mean, all of the other big moments, whether it's Vimy or whether it's the last spike in Craigellachie, BC, or whatever the other, symbolic huge moments of Canadian history, they weren't shared in a way in which this one was.
That's the right answer. The 12-year-old me thanks you and remembers that day extremely well. 50 years ago today, Game 8. That's a terrific book. It's a beautiful work of art. And I thank you, as always, for coming into our studio and sharing your wonderful views of this great game.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Ken Dryden.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka gets some perspective on what's happening in Iran as women there lead unprecedented protests and the state reacts. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.